Good afternoon and welcome to the Concord Bookshop. This year Concord celebrated its 375th anniversary of its incorporation as a town. To commemorate the event, today's speaker, Leslie Wilson, who's curator of the William Munroe Special Collection of the Concord Free Library and author of In History's Embrace, has written a new guide to Concord and combined it with Alan French's A Brief History of Concord, which was written in 1942, and that creates today's book. Now, there have been many noteworthy events in Concord after 1942, but we from the bookshop, since we were founded in 1940, think that that is kind of the peak.
Actually, Alan French stopped a lot earlier than 42.
Yes, he did. But yes, and as I wrote down here, to disabuse me of that notion, there is Leslie Wilson.
Well, thank you, everybody, for coming to this book signing. I thought what I would do before we get to the book signing part is just do a brief history of Historic Concord, because like everything else in Concord, Historic Concord has an interesting history. The book was first published in 1942, as was mentioned. But it's one, the thing that makes it really interesting is the fact that it's one of, I think, 3 comprehensive guidebooks to the historic sites of Concord, which is a fact that absolutely blows my mind when you think about how historic this landscape is. Why has it only inspired 3 comprehensive guidebooks? There have been a number of guidebooks of the sort of glitzy, photograph, souvenir variety, very superficial guidebooks. Concord is often, usually, a section in comprehensive guidebooks to the Boston area, and then it falls under the category, it's like one word, Lexington and Concord, one big word. And sometimes I can think of at least one guidebook to a very specialized area of the historic landscape, the Revolutionary sites. But as far as I know, the 1880 guidebook by George Bradford Bartlett and the 1888 guidebook by Margaret Sidney are the only guidebooks that deal with the entire historic landscape of Concord. So, I would like to talk, I'll start out with telling you a bit about the 1942 edition, but before I do that, I'd like to tell you a little bit about its predecessor. This is a Historic Concord, a 16-page history that was written by Alan French, who was the writer of the first edition of the guidebook and history, Historic Concord. This may be familiar to some of you, a John Hancock Mutual Life Insurance Company publication. They did a whole series of publications on mostly New England subjects, but some kind of patriotic American subjects. We call this in the special collections kind of familiarly prehistoric Concord. And basically it's simply a very short history. There's no guidebook component to this. Now, Alan French was closely associated. He was the reigning local historian of Concord in the early part of the 20th century, first half of the 20th century. And he was closely associated with the library. I believe he was the chairman of the library committee for a number of years. And was on the library committee even when he wasn't chairman. He was on it, as people did in those days, he was on the committee for decades. And so he would have been a natural person to write a guidebook to Concord and Lexington. So in 1942, the library published the first edition of Historic Concord, and Alan French, when he wrote it, included a foreword in which he described his motivation as being related to patriotism driven by the First World War and the Second World War. This was published during the Second World War. I thought that I would read the first paragraph of the foreword because I think it's very telling about what Alan French thought he was doing with the guidebook. He writes, "Modern wars have turned the thoughts of Americans to the history of their country, rousing the desire to see not merely its famous places, but particularly those where our national spirit has been most prominently revealed. After the First World War, this was proved in Historic Concord, capital H, capital C, by the stream of visitors who came to see the North Bridge, where Americans first marched against the British, who till that moment had been their fellow citizens. These pilgrim tourists found another interest in Concord because of the famous authors who lived there, who were among the first to give permanent expression to American literary ability, so on and so forth. The Second World War is turning the minds of our countrymen still more seriously to Concord's evidences of our national achievements. There is every reason to believe that once the limitations to travel are lifted, in future the visitors to Concord will be more numerous than ever. The other thing that Alan French didn't say was, in the 1930s and the 1940s, American literature was just becoming a respectable academic discipline. And so in 1936, Van Wyck Brooks had published Flowering of New England. In 1941, Ethel Matheson had published The American Renaissance, both very important works that reached broad audiences and that focused awareness on Concord as a place that people might want to visit. Okay, so main characteristics of the 1942 edition. In addition to the brief guide adapted from the 1924 John Hancock publication, the brief history, there is a guidebook. And in that guidebook, Alan French was very careful to include Lexington sites and discuss the role of Lexington on April 19th, 1775. He was smart. He knew that you cannot describe what happened in Concord on that day without describing what happened in Lexington on that day. And so he reached out to sort of incorporate some of the Lexington history and sites. The other thing that's a characteristic of, you can see the illustrations of this book, and these illustrations by Lester Hornby, who was, I think, a Gloucester or a Rockport artist. These survived through the first 3 editions of Historic Concord. They've only been removed in the current edition. The other thing that's very important about this edition is that Alan French, in the guidebook, set up the organization that survived all the way through the current edition, into the current edition. He determined that it made the most sense to start in Monument Square and then work down the roads that come off the square, the 5 major roads that come off the square. And believe me, when I was rewriting the guidebook, I gave some serious thought to other ways that I might organize the book, and I really couldn't come up with another way that would be workable for somebody plunked down in the center of town. You can organize things thematically, but this is not like writing an essay. This is, writing something for somebody whose feet are on the ground, and so the challenges are different. Okay, so Alan French died in 1946, and he didn't live long enough to see how correct he had been in assessing that there was going to be a major influx of tourists to Concord. And his book sold out. So we're going to fast forward to 1970. That's when the Friends of the Concord Free Public Library were formed. That's a fundraising and a programming organization associated with the library. One of the first things that the Friends, first projects that the Friends decided to undertake was a rewrite of, or a revision of this book, which was now out of print by the early 1970s, and for which nothing had come along to take the place. And so they saw it as a project for the community. And obviously Alan French couldn't rewrite it because he was long gone, and so they asked David Little to rewrite the book. I don't know if any of you remember, you'll remember David Little. He was a well-known and well-liked local historian in the mid to late 20th century in Concord. And so what he did, he didn't rewrite the text, he revised the text. And some people have said, well, how much does the historic landscape change? But in fact, that's one of the underappreciated facts about doing something like this, is that it's going to be outdated every 5 to 10 years. think about what happened between 1942 and 1978, the biggest thing in the historic landscape was Minuteman National Historical Park was established in 1959. That had to be taken into account. The Hornby illustrations, as I said, survived in this edition. They added color plates. I don't know if you're familiar with the Amos Doolittle engravings of the battle. Yeah, you are. Okay. Well, so there's 4 engravings, and they got permission from, the Friends got permission from the Lexington Historical Society. The Friends found that it was a slow but steady seller. It didn't make a lot of money, but making money was not primarily, or not the only motivation in the library's the Friends of the Library's publishing this. They were striving to meet that need that wasn't really met by any other book, and so so Historic Concord did pretty well into the early 1990s, I guess, or about 1990, and by that time it had just about sold out, and so the Friends decided, okay, we're going to do another edition, and at that David Little was still well and willing. And so he revised it again. Not too many changes between the 2nd edition and the 3rd edition. There were more, obviously some of the sites had changed, information about the sites had changed. One of the things that he did was to include a long section by Larry Gall, who was superintendent of the Minuteman National Historical Park, right into the text in the vicinity of his information about the park. And I can see why he did that, but at this point the book was starting to show the fact that this was a twice revised book, because it was starting to lose its coherence. And some of the organization, some of the information, contact information for the sites ended up at the beginning of the book, and it was very distracting, and so the nature of the book was changing. In this edition, though, 2 things. David Little incorporated a couple of historical illustrations, photographs from the Concord Free Public Library Special Collections for a new visitor center in Concord. He was very devoted to the idea of getting something better for Concord than the visitor center on Haywood Meadow. And so in the prefatory material you find sort of a plug or two for a new visitor center. And actually he compares it with Lexington's visitor center most unfavorably, the current visitor center, so works on that competition element a little bit. Okay, so this was almost sold out. I think there may actually still be some copies, but around 2007, people in the Friends started thinking about the fact that it was outdated, and that it might be a good idea to rewrite it. David Little died in 1995, and so obviously he wasn't going to be able to rewrite it, and that's the point at which I became involved. Barbara Powell, who was the former library director, the Friends asked me through Barbara Powell if I would be interested, and I jumped at the chance because A, I like to write about anything to do with Concord, and B, it doesn't naturally, it may not seem like an obvious thing, but actually the library special collections is a destination for some of the pilgrims who come through, tourist pilgrims who come through Concord, and so I stood to gain by having an updated, improved version of Historic Concord as much as anybody at the Manse or the Emerson House or any of the other sites, and so I said yes, very happily. My major collaborator through the project was Sherry Litwack. I'm sure some of you know her. She has been associated with the Friends of the Library for a long time. She's now the president of the Library Corporation, and she also, her career is in publishing, and so she's a natural person to work on designing and working out the details of a book, and she was great to work with. I'd love to work on another project with her. So we had some major questions to decide, to answer when we started on the project. First thing we decided to do, we talked about the scheduling of it and realized that the 375th anniversary of Concord was just a couple of years down the road, and that made a natural publication date for the book. You know, it sort of it made a ready market for the book, and it also provided us with a date, a deadline. And when you're working on a project, if you don't have a deadline, it can be very difficult to actually see it through in a timely fashion. So we decided that the 375th, and this would actually be the 375th anniversary edition. Other questions: how seriously to rewrite the book, to revise the book? And you know, we looked at the text of the last edition and saw how it was not really hanging together very well anymore. There were many more sites on the Concord landscape. There are things that, you know, the interpretation of history changes over time, and so places like 9 Acre Corner that are important for farming history, maybe in Alan French's time, just seemed like local places, or West Concord, or the anti-slavery and Underground Railroad sites that are in the vicinity of the library. In 1942, people weren't paying that much attention to those. Nowadays, they are major subjects for research, and so you need to include a broader range of sites in the book. And the interpretation, the fact that some of the sites, when you think about the Barrett Farmhouse, you think about the Thoreau Birthplace, those are sites that have changed their status in very recent years, and so you need to incorporate them in a different kind of way than in previous editions. As far as the physical layout of the book went, Sherry and I talked, and we decided that by this edition, Lester Hornby was starting to look really tired and didn't really appeal to modern taste in the way that historical photographs do. So we decided to use all illustrations from the library special collections, mostly photographs and some other engravings and things as well. The purpose of that is dual, not only to get rid of Lester Hornby, but we wanted to focus on the library collections and make people aware of the fact that there are great riches in the Concord Free Public Library, and so we wanted to bring that out. Sherry was determined that we were going to have really good maps, and so we ended up hiring an artist who is also a map maker to do the kind of detailed maps that of the historic landscape that really were lacking in the earlier volumes. There were maps, but they weren't in as much detail. So we got two fold-out maps, one of Concord and one of Lexington and the Battle Road. And Sherry and the friends decided to hire a book designer so that the look of the book could be changed from this, which was really the look of the previous two editions, to this, which is a much zippier looking book, I think. And so the book designer was Chris Evans. She's a very talented woman, and we're very pleased with the results. Next stage, after the writing, which took about a year from start to finish, and during that process, I ended up doing some field trips to Concord sites, which most of them I've been to before. And it's different when you're going to a site, thinking about describing that site. And Lexington, I hadn't been to Lexington probably since I was 12 years old. And so it was a lot of fun getting on the Liberty ride and heading over to Lexington, and you know, sort of walking the landscape, realizing that I was going to end up having to describe what I was seeing. And so that process was fun. But the next process was a kind of a peer review. You know, Concord is a fairly intense historical community. There are a lot of people who know a lot about a lot of things, and the last thing that you want to do is to issue a book without giving some of these people a chance to say, look at that, you got that wrong. Sometimes before it's published, and you want the chance to edit. And so a number of very generous people read the manuscript and made some comments, and it's definitely a better book for that input. So it was published in by about June it came out. I think we got the copies at the end of June or the beginning of July. And it's it's definitely hitting its two targeted audiences. Obviously, visitors to Concord, out-of-towners, and also people in Concord who just moved to Concord and want to know something about the town, and people who've lived here for a long time but feel like they don't know enough to help their guests from out of town decide what they want to see. And of course, it makes a great Christmas present too. So, I'll be happy to answer any questions you have about the book, about the book's history, the new book, or whatever. Or signed books.
Yes. Did I hear you say that it didn't become a national park until the late 50s?
1959 is when it was established, and yeah, and they've worked on, making it a park for a couple of decades now. Yeah.
I hate to say it, I was here maybe 2 years after it opened.
Is that right? Well, yeah, but I think the big center, the center on Lexington Road, opened in the, was it 1970s that it opened? But they're still working on it. The next edition of Historic Concord will have. Actually, that's another thing that I would want to add is that. Will there be another edition? I'm sure there will be another edition 10 or 15 years down the road. What is that book going to look like? I think it's going to, obviously the guidebook will have to be rewritten. I think with the next edition it's time to retire Alan French's history too, because it was written in '42 and it was great as far as it went, but he was writing from a point of view with attitudes about history that people really don't subscribe to anymore, and so it's becoming outdated. In '42, it was okay to write about Native Americans as savages. I've got a footnote in the book at the end of the history section, not exactly apologizing, but saying that if he were writing today, he would be using some other term. And then there are other explanatory footnotes to the '42 history. But there's only so far you want to do that before that becomes tired too. So something fresh next time as far as the history goes. So. Okay, well, I'll be happy to sign books if anybody wants a copy signed.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Signing books. They make great Christmas presents.